In a world where assumptions rule, where judgments are often made without thought, a shocking story unfolds. A black man, handcuffed, humiliated, arrested on the street for no reason other than the color of his skin. But here's where the narrative shifts. This man, who the police believed was just another face in the crowd, holds a secret that would shake the very foundation of their prejudice. What if the one they thought was powerless was, in fact, one of the most powerful civil rights attorneys in the country? This revelation is what turns an unjust arrest into a reckoning, not only for the officers involved, but for a system that's been broken for far too long. Stay with me, because this story is more than just an arrest. It's about the power of truth, resilience, and the retribution that comes when the tables finally turn. But first, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story full of unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Jimmy Oliver was walking calmly through the streets of his neighborhood, his mind away from daily problems, when two police officers, Clark and Jackson, abruptly stopped him. The sound of sirens and the flash of red and blue lights broke the silence, signaling the beginning of a situation that would change his life. "Stop right there," Clark yelled, hand on his gun, while Jackson, with a tense expression, approached Jimmy. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he knew very well the reason for the stop. Deep down, he knew it wasn't about what he had done, but about who he was, a black man in a society marked by prejudice. As he was being searched, Jimmy felt the penetrating gaze of the officers. Clark, visibly suspicious, kept looking for a reason to keep him there. "Do you have something on you?" Jackson asked, already presuming guilt without any evidence. Jimmy, with the calmness that only the courage of someone who has faced many battles could provide, replied, "I haven't done anything wrong, I was just heading home." His voice was steady but filled with restrained emotion. He knew that this moment wasn't just another ordinary day. It was a reflection of a reality lived by many. Clark didn't care about Jimmy's words. To him, everyone was a suspect until proven otherwise, especially someone like Jimmy. The search for some alleged guilt seemed like an obsession. "Raise your arms," Clark ordered, while Jackson stayed close, ready for anything. Jimmy complied without hesitation, knowing that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. There was an invisible tension in the air, and even though Jimmy was a man of the law, he knew that at that moment, the law wasn't on his side. Jimmy's heart raced, not out of fear, but out of anger. He was a man who fought for justice every day, but at that moment, he was being treated like a criminal. "What's the charge?" he asked, keeping his composure. Clark and Jackson exchanged glances, not knowing what to respond right away. It was clear there was no legitimate reason for the stop. Yet the feeling of power over Jimmy seemed intoxicating to the officers, who continued with the unjust treatment, without thinking about the consequences. Meanwhile, a small crowd began to gather around. People watched, some with curiosity, others with indignation. "He didn't do anything," shouted a woman from the sidewalk. Jimmy felt a wave of solidarity, realizing he wasn't entirely alone. Though he was the target of prejudice and injustice, there were people who recognized the abuse. The courage to face this situation didn't come only from his experience, but also from the hope that somehow the truth would prevail. "We're taking him to the station," said Jackson, as he put the handcuffs on Jimmy. The cold metallic feel around his wrists was a bitter reminder that for many, justice was a distant word. "This is a mistake," Jimmy affirmed, looking Jackson straight in the eye. "You know you're making a mistake." Jackson briefly looked away, perhaps a sign of doubt creeping into his mind, but arrogance and pride prevented him from stepping back. To them, Jimmy was just another number. In the police car, Jimmy looked out the window, trying to stay calm. He knew that once again he was being targeted by a broken system. But at the same time, he had faith that something bigger was on the horizon. This wouldn't be the end of his story. At the station, as he was pushed into the interrogation room, Jimmy's mind raced through the countless injustices he had witnessed throughout his career. Now, ironically, he was on the other side. And once again, injustice was showing its cruel face. While waiting in the cold station room, Jimmy reflected on the irony of the situation. He, a civil rights lawyer who had dedicated his life to fighting abuse of power, was now in handcuffs, accused of a crime he didn't commit. "They have no idea," he thought to himself. He knew that his true identity would soon be revealed, and then the turning point he was waiting for would come with full force. But until that moment arrived, Jimmy had to keep his head held high and maintain the calm that only faith could provide. The minutes felt like hours as Jimmy waited. Outside, the crowd was growing. Some people had already started openly questioning the police's actions. "This is absurd," shouted a man in front of the station. Jimmy knew that this moment was a reflection of something much bigger. He wasn't just being arrested for being Jimmy Oliver. He was being arrested because he represented everything that societal prejudices didn't want to accept. Still, he held on to the hope that something good would come from all this chaos. Clark and Jackson, now inside the room, continued their arrogant stance. "Let's see how long you can go without confessing," Clark said, as if he had already decided Jimmy was guilty. But Jimmy's strength didn't lie only in his abilities as a lawyer, but in his unshakable faith. He knew that sooner or later the truth would be revealed. "You're making a mistake," Jimmy repeated, this time more firmly. He knew that soon his words would make sense to those who now treated him with disdain. As tension built in the room, a veteran officer walked in, observing the situation from afar. It was Officer Martin, who had dealt with many delicate situations throughout his career. When he looked at Jimmy, something in his expression changed. There was something familiar about this man. Martin couldn't ignore the feeling that he knew Jimmy from somewhere. "What's his name?" Martin asked one of the officers, and upon hearing the response, his eyes widened. The revelation was about to happen. Outside, the crowd was starting to get restless. Shouts and calls for justice echoed through the streets as the police tried to control the situation. The media had arrived, and cameras were now capturing every movement. "Let him go," shouted a man with a megaphone, while others held signs condemning police brutality. Jimmy, inside the station, knew that external pressure was mounting, but he still had to wait for the right moment for everything to resolve itself. Despite the tension, Jimmy knew that this situation would become something much larger. He felt that an important revelation was about to happen, something that would not only change his situation, but also many people's perception of the police system. "You'll soon understand," Jimmy thought, remaining calm. The true identity of Jimmy Oliver, the civil rights attorney, was about to be revealed. And when that happened, everything would change. But the question was, were the police ready to deal with the truth? As Jimmy sat silently in the interrogation room, the realization of who he was began to slowly unfold for the officers outside. Jackson, still perplexed by Jimmy's calm demeanor, felt something was off. "Why isn't he scared? Why isn't he reacting like the others?" he muttered to Clark. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances. Clark shrugged it off, still holding onto his sense of control over the situation. "He's probably just good at hiding it," Clark said, trying to convince himself more than his partner. But deep down, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man. Jimmy, meanwhile, remained composed. He had seen countless cases like this before, people wrongfully accused, their rights stripped away because of their skin color. But he also knew something they didn't. His reputation as a civil rights lawyer was well known, and soon the walls of ignorance around these officers would start to crumble. The power dynamics were about to shift, and Jimmy's faith in that retribution kept him steady. As much as they tried to intimidate him, the real surprise was coming. It was Officer Martin who first stumbled upon the truth. While reviewing Jimmy's file, something caught his eye. "Wait a minute," he murmured, scrolling through the records. There it was. Jimmy Oliver, one of the leading civil rights attorneys in the country, had represented numerous high-profile cases of police misconduct. Martin's hands began to tremble slightly as he realized the gravity of what had just happened. "Oh no, this is bad," he whispered to himself. A sense of dread filled the room. He knew that the discovery of Jimmy's identity was about to flip the entire situation upside down. Back in the interrogation room, Jimmy noticed the shift in energy. There was a silence that seemed louder than any of the previous accusations. He could feel the weight of realization sinking in on the officers. He didn't say a word, but the small, knowing smile on his face said it all. Jackson, now visibly uncomfortable, entered the room again. this time without the bravado he had earlier. "So, Mr. Oliver, it seems like we've got a bit of a misunderstanding here," Jackson said, trying to keep his tone neutral. But Jimmy could hear the fear creeping into his voice. "Misunderstanding," Jimmy replied calmly, his eyes fixed on Jackson. "No, officer. What you have is a pattern of prejudice and misconduct, and now you've been caught." His words were sharp but measured, delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years fighting for justice. Jackson flinched. The power dynamic had officially shifted, and there was no going back. Every word Jimmy spoke now carried the weight of authority, and Jackson was fully aware of it. Clark, still clinging to some semblance of control, barged into the room, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "Look, we made a mistake, but let's not blow this out of proportion," Clark said, his voice laced with desperation. Jimmy raised an eyebrow, his calm composure unwavering. "A mistake," he echoed. "You think this is just a mistake? How many people like me have you stopped today, Clark? How many didn't have the chance to be heard because they didn't have the platform I do?" The room fell silent. Jimmy's words cut through the air like a knife, and for the first time, Clark seemed to understand the gravity of his actions. Outside, Officer Martin was scrambling. He had informed his superiors, and the station was now in damage control mode. "We need to fix this fast," Martin said to the chief, who was already sweating bullets. The chief, known for his hardline stance, now found himself in the middle of a brewing scandal that could tarnish the entire department. "Get in there, apologize, and for God's sake make sure this doesn't leave the station," the chief ordered. But it was too late. Word was already spreading, and the media outside was eager for a statement. Back in the room, Jimmy could sense the panic building. Jackson and Clark were visibly on edge, their authority eroding with every second that passed. "So what now?" Jimmy asked, leaning back in his chair, his voice dripping with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. Jackson tried to respond, but his words faltered. He was no longer in control, and he knew it. The truth was out, and there was nothing they could do to put it back in the box. As the minutes ticked by, the station grew more chaotic. Reporters were calling for statements, and the crowd outside had doubled in size. People were demanding justice, and Jimmy's name was beginning to circulate through the media. Inside the interrogation room, Jimmy sat like a king on his throne, knowing that the retribution he sought was unfolding in real time. His faith had never wavered, and now the very system that tried to oppress him was starting to collapse under the weight of its own mistakes. Officer Martin finally entered the room, his face a mix of guilt and panic. "Mr. Oliver," he began, but Jimmy cut him off. "You know who I am, Officer Martin, and you know what needs to be done." Martin swallowed hard, realizing there was no easy way out of this. He glanced at Jackson and Clark, both of whom were now pale, knowing their careers hung in the balance. We're sorry," Martin stammered, but Jimmy shook his head. "Sorry won't cut it," he replied. "You've opened a door here, and now the world is watching." As Martin tried to salvage the situation, Jimmy stood up, the shackles of injustice falling away with every step. He wasn't just a victim of their prejudice. He was a symbol of perseverance, a living testament to the power of faith in the face of oppression. The officers, once so sure of their power, now stood helpless as Jimmy walked past them, a free man. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The true identity of Jimmy Oliver had been revealed, and with it, a wave of accountability was about to crash down on the entire department. With each step out of the station, Jimmy knew that his battle was far from over. There were many more like him, still facing the same injustice, still shackled by a broken system. But for today, a victory had been won. He walked out of the station not just as a lawyer, but as a beacon of hope for those still waiting for their moment of justice. The revelation of his identity was the spark that would ignite a movement. And as he stepped into the daylight, Jimmy knew that the fight for justice was only just beginning. As news of Jimmy's arrest spread, A crowd began to form outside the police station. What started as a handful of concerned citizens quickly grew into a mass of people, all demanding justice for the man they believed was wrongfully detained. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anger, frustration, and hope. "This isn't right," someone shouted, holding up a sign that read, "Justice for Jimmy." The crowd's energy was contagious, and it wasn't long before local activists and community leaders began to show up, adding fuel to the growing fire. Jimmy had unknowingly become a symbol, and the situation was rapidly escalating. Inside the station, the officers could feel the pressure mounting. The phones rang incessantly as reporters and concerned citizens demanded answers. Clark paced back and forth, his confidence from earlier in the day evaporating with each passing second. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered under his breath. Jackson, too, was on edge. He could hear the chanting from outside growing louder, a constant reminder that they were no longer in control. "We need to do something," Jackson said, his voice tinged with desperation. Jimmy sat in the interrogation room, listening to the distant echoes of the crowd. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before in the countless cases he had fought. The power of collective action was not to be underestimated. Every chant, every raised fist outside was a testament to the people's faith in justice, and it gave him strength. Jimmy closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the weight of the situation. He was not just a man fighting for his own freedom. He was now the voice of many who had been silenced for far too long. The crowd outside continued to grow, with the media now fully involved. News vans lined the streets, and cameras captured every moment. Reporters jockeyed for position, trying to get the best shot or the latest scoop. "This could turn into a real nightmare for the department," said one journalist speaking live on air. The pressure on the police was immense, and it was clear that the public wasn't going to back down easily. The story of Jimmy Oliver, a respected civil rights attorney being wrongfully arrested, was a scandal in the making. Inside, tensions among the officers were at an all-time high. Martin, still reeling from the discovery of Jimmy's identity, was trying to manage the situation. "We need to release him before this gets any worse," he said, glancing nervously at the chief. The chief, however, wasn't ready to concede. "We can't just let him go," he replied, stubbornly clinging to the belief that they still had control. But Martin knew better. He had seen situations like this spiral out of control, and the writing was on the wall. The people outside weren't going anywhere, and the longer they held Jimmy, the worse it would get. As the sun began to set, the crowd outside only grew louder. "Release Jimmy!" they chanted in unison, their voices echoing down the streets. The police officers, now visibly nervous, looked out at the sea of people with apprehension. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement, and the longer they waited to act, the more power the movement gained. Jackson, who had been one of the most aggressive officers earlier, now stood by the window, his face pale. "We need to end this," he said quietly, his previous bravado long gone. Jimmy, still in the interrogation room, could feel the shift in energy. He had fought for justice his entire life, but this moment felt different. There was something bigger at play, something that went beyond his individual case. The people outside weren't just fighting for him. They were fighting for themselves, for their families, for their communities. The repressive system that had oppressed them for so long was being challenged, and Jimmy knew that this was a pivotal moment. "They're not just here for me," he thought. "They're here for all of us." The officers were scrambling to figure out their next move. The chief, still unwilling to back down, was running out of options. "We can't give in to mob mentality," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Even he could see the writing on the wall. The media had already picked up the story, and soon the entire country would know what was happening. Martin, seeing that the chief was losing control of the situation, stepped in. "We need to think about the bigger picture," he said. "This isn't just about today. This could have long-term consequences for all of us." As darkness fell, the tension inside the station reached its breaking point. The crowd outside was now in the hundreds, and their chants had become a steady rhythm that reverberated through the walls of the station. The officers knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Jackson, who had been one of the most vocal advocates for holding Jimmy, was now the one pushing for his release. "We need to let him go," he said firmly. "If we don't, this could get ugly fast." The chief, seeing that he had no other option, finally relented. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with defeat, "but this doesn't leave the station." Martin, feeling a sense of relief, nodded and immediately went to Jimmy's cell. "It's time," he said, unlocking the door. Jimmy stood up, his expression calm and resolute. He had known this moment was coming, and now that it was here, he was ready. As he stepped out of the cell, Martin looked at him with a mix of respect and guilt. "You didn't deserve this," he said quietly. Jimmy nodded but didn't respond. There was no need for words, actions would speak louder. As Jimmy was escorted to the front of the station, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. They had won this battle, but Jimmy knew the war was far from over. He stepped outside, greeted by the flashing lights of cameras and the roar of the crowd. "Justice for Jimmy!" they shouted, but Jimmy raised his hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice calm but powerful. "This is about all of us, about the system that has failed too many for too long. And today, we've shown that we won't be silenced anymore." Inside the station, the air was thick with tension. The revelation of Jimmy's true identity had shaken the officers to their core, and now they were scrambling to contain the damage. Officer Martin, having informed his superiors, stood at the edge of the chaos. "This is a mess," he muttered, rubbing his temples as the pressure mounted. The station's phones hadn't stopped ringing since the media got wind of the situation, and the chief, once confident in his authority, was now overwhelmed by the unfolding crisis. He paced in his office, trying to figure out a way to salvage the department's reputation. Martin, still processing the weight of his discovery, knew that things were only going to get worse. "We need to make a move," he said to his fellow officers. But the chief, unwilling to fully grasp the magnitude of the situation, was hesitant. "We can't just cave in," he said, his voice betraying the fear that had begun to creep into his mind. "If we admit we were wrong, it'll be the end of us." Martin shook his head. "It's not about admitting fault," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "It's about doing the right thing before it's too late." The station had become a pressure cooker, with every officer on edge. Clark, who had initially led the charge against Jimmy, was now filled with regret. He hadn't anticipated that things would escalate this way. "We messed up, didn't we?" Clark said to Jackson, his voice barely above a whisper. Jackson, who had been one of the more aggressive officers during the arrest, remained silent. The reality of their mistake was setting in, and neither of them knew how to fix it. The department was on the brink of a full-blown crisis, and the fallout would be severe. Outside, the crowd continued to swell, demanding justice not just for Jimmy, but for the countless others who had suffered under the weight of a flawed system. The chanting was relentless, growing louder with every passing minute. "This is getting out of hand," Jackson said, glancing nervously out the window at the sea of protesters. The officers inside knew that if they didn't act soon, they risked losing control completely. The reckoning they had tried to avoid was now staring them in the face, and there was no turning back. The chief, feeling the walls closing in, finally called Martin into his office. "What's the plan here?" he asked, trying to maintain some semblance of control. Martin, who had been following the situation closely, didn't mince words. "We need to release him, now, and we need to make a public statement about what happened." The chief winced at the suggestion. "You can't be serious," he said, shaking his head. "Do you realize what that would mean for the department?" But Martin was unyielding. "If we don't act now, this will destroy us." The conversation hung in the air like a storm cloud. The chief, realizing he had no other options, reluctantly agreed. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But this stays between us." Martin nodded, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. As he left the chief's office, he could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He knew that this wasn't just about releasing Jimmy. It was about confronting a system that had been broken for far too long. And now that system was being exposed for all to see. Back in the main room, the officers were on edge. Jackson, who had once stood tall in his authority, now felt small and powerless. "What happens to us now?" he asked Martin as the two passed in the hallway. Martin didn't have an answer. The department was spiraling, and the reckoning that was coming would spare no one. "We face the consequences," Martin finally said, his voice steady but somber. "It's time we took responsibility for what's happened." As Martin prepared to release Jimmy, the station's atmosphere became increasingly charged. Reporters were camped outside, ready to broadcast every detail, and the protesters were showing no signs of slowing down. "This is bigger than us," Martin thought to himself as he walked toward Jimmy's holding cell. He knew that the moment Jimmy walked free, the world would be watching. The department had tried to contain the situation, but now the floodgates were about to open. When Martin arrived at Jimmy's cell, he paused for a moment before unlocking the door. "It's time," he said quietly, the weight of the situation evident in his voice. Jimmy stood up, calm and composed as always, and nodded. "I knew it would come to this," Jimmy replied, his tone unwavering. As Martin escorted him out of the cell, the other officers looked on in silence. There was no need for words. Everyone in the station knew that they had crossed a line, and now the reckoning was upon them. As they approached the front of the station, the sounds of the protesters outside grew louder. Jimmy, still calm, turned to Martin. "You know this isn't just about me," he said. "This is about the system, and it's about to change." Martin nodded, understanding the gravity of Jimmy's words. He had spent years working within the system, but now, for the first time, he could see it for what it really was: broken, corrupt, and in desperate need of reform. The reckoning wasn't just coming for the police, it was coming for the entire system. With each step toward the front door, the tension in the station grew. The officers who had once been so sure of their power now stood frozen, unsure of what the future held. The reckoning had arrived, and there was no escaping it. As Martin opened the door to the station, the roar of the crowd hit them like a wave. Jimmy stepped out into the sunlight, free at last, but the battle was far from over. The world was watching, and the reckoning had only just begun. The crowd outside the station had swelled to a size no one had anticipated. People from all walks of life had gathered, unified in their call for justice. The sound of chanting echoed down the street. "Free Jimmy! Free Jimmy!" The protest had transformed from a small gathering into a massive show of solidarity, a clear message to the police that the public would not stand for this kind of injustice any longer. Among the signs and banners were faces full of determination and hope. It was no longer just about Jimmy Oliver. It was about every individual who had ever suffered under a broken system. Inside the station, the pressure was unbearable. The chief stood by the window, watching the crowd grow with each passing minute. "We have to end this now," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a sense of helplessness. The department's reputation was hanging by a thread, and it was only a matter of time before it snapped. "Get him out of here," the chief finally ordered, his voice heavy with resignation. He knew they had lost this battle. Martin, who had been the voice of reason throughout the ordeal, stepped forward to carry out the order. He knew that Jimmy's release wouldn't just be the end of this specific incident. It would be the beginning of a much larger conversation about police reform, about accountability, and about systemic change. As he walked toward Jimmy's cell, the chants from outside grew louder, almost as if the crowd knew what was about to happen. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable sense that history was being made. Jimmy, sitting calmly in his cell, could hear the noise from outside. He had spent years fighting for justice, and now it was here, knocking at the door. As Martin unlocked the cell, Jimmy stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he knew that every action he took from this moment on would be watched and remembered. "It's time," Martin said softly, Jimmy nodded, his expression calm but resolute. He knew that walking out of the station wasn't just about his own freedom, it was about the freedom of so many others, still trapped by injustice. As Jimmy was led through the station, the eyes of every officer followed him. Some looked down, unable to meet his gaze, while others watched in silent awe. They knew that they had played a part in something much larger than themselves, and the weight of their actions was finally sinking in. For Clark and Jackson, the two officers who had started this ordeal, the moment was particularly difficult. What had begun as a routine stop had spiraled into a public relations nightmare, and they now faced the consequences of their actions. When the front doors of the station opened, the roar of the crowd was deafening. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and the people outside erupted in cheers. Jimmy stepped out into the sunlight, his head held high. The crowd surged forward, their chants of justice filling the air. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Jimmy, the man who had been wrongfully imprisoned, was now free, and his release was a powerful symbol of hope and resilience for everyone present. Martin stood by Jimmy's side, feeling the weight of the moment. He had been part of the system for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to truly fight for justice. But seeing the reaction of the crowd, the joy on their faces, he realized that this was what law enforcement should be about: protecting the rights of the people, not oppressing them. As the cheers continued, Martin glanced over at Jimmy, who was now addressing the crowd. "This isn't just about me," Jimmy began, his voice clear and strong. "This is about all of us. This is about changing a system that has been broken for far too long." The crowd hung on his every word. "We have the power to demand change," Jimmy continued. "Today we've shown that when we come together, we can make a difference. But this is just the beginning." The crowd erupted once again, their energy electrifying. Jimmy's words resonated deeply with everyone present. He wasn't just speaking as a lawyer or as a victim of injustice. He was speaking as a leader, someone who had dedicated his life to fighting for what was right. And now, in this moment, the people were listening. As the protest continued, the media captured every second of it. News outlets across the country began broadcasting the scene, and soon, Jimmy's story was on every television screen. Social media lit up with messages of support, with hashtags like #JusticeForJimmy and #ReformNow trending worldwide. The release of Jimmy Oliver had become a national event, a symbol of the larger fight for justice that so many people had been yearning for. The protest outside the station was just the beginning. The ripples of this moment would be felt for a long time. Inside the station, the officers watched the scene unfold, knowing that the world was watching them. The chief, standing in the back, finally realized the gravity of the situation. "This is going to change everything," he muttered to himself, unable to look away from the screen. And he was right. The release of Jimmy Oliver had sparked a movement, one that would demand accountability, reform, and a complete overhaul of the justice system. As the sun began to set, the crowd outside the station showed no signs of dispersing. They were there not just to celebrate Jimmy's release, but to send a message that they wouldn't rest until real change had been achieved. Jimmy stood at the front of the crowd, his voice clear and unwavering as he continued to speak. "We're not done yet," he said. "We've just begun." And as the crowd roared in agreement, it was clear that the fight for justice had only just begun. "Now that you've seen the truth unfold, let me ask you this. What would you do if you were in Jimmy's shoes? Would you have the courage to stand firm, to fight for justice when everything seems stacked against you?" The story doesn't end here, it's just the beginning, because the fight for justice is ongoing, and each of us has a role to play. Think about the systems we trust. Are they working for everyone? Are they protecting the people they should? And what can you do today to demand accountability and create real change? The truth is, stories like Jimmy's are happening every day, but it doesn't have to be that way. You have the power to make a difference, to be a part of the movement for change. So, if you want to continue learning about these important issues and how you can take action, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss out on a story that could inspire you to take the next step. Because together, we can create a world where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality for everyone.